Marin Castell walked into that private dining room, expecting the worst night of her life. Her co-workers had promised her exactly that, and they'd been smiling when they did it. She was 3 months behind on rent, and one bad shift from losing the apartment. So when the floor manager told her, a wealthy regular, had requested her by name for a private dinner, she borrowed a dress, tied back her hair, and went. She thought the cruelty would be simple, a joke, a story they'd laugh about in the break room for a month. She did not know that the man waiting at the head of that long table couldn't hear a single word she would say to him. She did not know he owned the building, the block, and a frightening number of the people who ran the city after dark. And she had no idea that before the candles burned down to their brass holders, 3 of the people who set her up would wish they had never learned her name. The Gilded Heron sat at the top of a glass tower, where the river bent through the middle of the city, and every night it filled with people who had never once worried about the price of anything. Marin Castell worked the floor there 6 nights a week, sometimes 7. She was 26, though the long shifts had started to add years around her eyes. She had a way of moving through the dining room that made her nearly invisible, quick, quiet, always at the elbow of a guest half a second before they thought to raise a hand. It was a skill she had sharpened until it became a kind of armor. If they didn't notice her, they couldn't complain about her, and complaints at the Heron cost you shifts. She needed every shift. Her real life waited in a 2-room apartment, 40 minutes across the river, on the 4th floor of a building where the elevator had been broken since spring. That was where her brother lived. For Amel was 8 years old, small for his age, with a cowlick that refused every comb, and a laugh that took up the whole room. Emile had been deaf since birth. When their parents died, a wet road, a delivery truck, a single terrible night 3 years ago, Marin had been 23, and halfway through a degree she never finished. She'd signed the guardianship papers with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and she had not slept a full night since she had learned to sign, before she learned to drive. Their mother had insisted on it when Emile was a baby, and so the whole family had learned together at the kitchen table, laughing at their own clumsy hands. Now it was the only language that mattered in Marin's home. She and Emile talked for hours, without making a sound, about his day, about the fish he wanted for his birthday, about the stars he couldn't quite see through the city glow. Her hands were fluent in a way her voice had never been. She could say things with her fingers that she could never quite say out loud. At the restaurant, no one knew any of this. At the restaurant, she was just Castell, the quiet one who never joined them for drinks after close, who counted her tips in the stairwell instead of the break room, who always seemed to be somewhere else even when she was standing right in front of you. They didn't know that the somewhere else was a 4th-floor kitchen where a small boy waited up past his bedtime to tell her, in a flurry of hands, everything that had happened at school. They didn't know she took the late bus so she could pick up the closing shift's extra hour, or that she ate the kitchen's mistakes off the return tray so she wouldn't have to spend on dinner, or that the good navy dress she owned had been her mother's and let out twice. They saw the cheap shoes and the careful stillness, and decided they had her measured. People usually did. Marin had learned young that letting them think they'd figured you out was its own kind of privacy. She told herself it didn't matter what they thought. Most nights she almost believed it. The tips were the whole reason she survived, and the tips at the Heron were extraordinary when they came. A single generous table could mean the difference between the pharmacy and the pawn shop. So, she smiled at men who didn't look at her face, and refilled the glasses of women who spoke about her in the third person while she stood at their elbow, and she kept her small ledger of the world in her head: who tipped, who complained, who to avoid, who to court. It was survival, dressed up in a black apron, and she was very, very good at it. There was one guest at the Heron that everyone talked about, and no one dared approach. He came on Thursdays, always alone, always to the same corner table, with its back to the wall and a clean line of sight to both exits. He was somewhere in his 30s, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going early to silver at the temples, and a stillness about him that made the waitstaff draw straws over who had to take his order. He never spoke, not a word. He would tap the menu, hold up fingers, write on the little pad he carried, and he left tips so large that management pretended not to notice. He unsettled the whole room. The others had 100 theories. He was a widower who'd gone mute with grief. He was a criminal, in hiding. He was a foreign prince, hiding from something. Bexley, the senior server, swore he was touched in the head and refused to make eye contact with him, as if strangeness were something you could catch. Marin had waited on him twice, on nights when no one else would. Both times, she had noticed what the others missed. The way his eyes went to her mouth when she spoke, patient, reading. The way he watched hands, every hand in the room, the busboys, the bartenders, hers. The second time, when she'd set down his plate, she had done something without thinking about it. She had let her fingers move at her side, low and small, where the room couldn't see. Enjoy your meal. For 1/2 second, the man had gone completely still. Then his gaze lifted to her face, and something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name, surprise, or hunger, or the look of a man who has been thirsty a long time and just heard water. She had walked away fast, her heart doing something foolish, and told herself she had imagined it. That had been 2 weeks ago. He hadn't taken his usual corner table since. And Marin, who had trained herself not to want things, had caught herself watching that empty table on Thursdays anyway. Tonight was a Thursday. The corner table was empty. She was refilling water glasses at Station 4 when she felt it, the particular prickle at the back of the neck that a person gets when they are being discussed. She glanced toward the service bay. Bexley stood there with 2 of the others, heads bent close, and when Marin looked over, all 3 of them smiled at her at once. It was not a kind smile. She had learned, over 3 hard years, to tell the difference. Bexley lifted her hand and gave a little wave, fingers wiggling. Sweet as poison, Marin turned back to her water glasses and told herself again that it didn't matter what they thought. She was wrong about that. She was about to find out exactly how wrong. The idea had started, like most cruel things at the Gilded Heron, as a joke that no one meant to actually carry out. It belonged to Bexley. She was 31, had worked the floor for 9 years, and considered the Heron's best tables her personal territory. She was quick, she was charming to anyone who could tip or fire her, and she had disliked Marin Castell from the day the girl was hired. Disliked her quiet, disliked her competence, disliked the way big tables sometimes asked for the calm one, by description if not by name. Bexley had a talent for finding the exact place a person was tender and pressing on it until they flinched. Marin never flinched. That, more than anything, was unforgivable. She thinks she's above it, Bexley said, low, in the dry storeroom behind the kitchen, where 3 of them had gathered on their break. Never comes out with us, won't take a drink, counts her little tips like a church mouse. She peeled the foil off a wine bottle they weren't supposed to touch. Somebody ought to remind her what she actually is. Tobin leaned against the shelving. He was younger, a bartender with a phone always in his hand, and a following online he cared about more than the job. He liked Bexley the way small men like standing next to a fire. Remind her how. Corley, the third of them, was already grinning. She was the kind of person who never started anything and never once said no to it either. You know who came in yesterday and booked the whole private room for Thursday? Paid in cash. For 2. Bexley's eyes sharpened. The mute, Corley confirmed, delighted. Table for 2, and the manager's climbing the walls because the guy scares him. Nobody wants to serve it. For a moment, none of them spoke, and then the whole ugly shape of it assembled itself in the air between them, and Bexley began, slowly, to smile. Here was the plan, and it was cruel in the way that only small, safe people can be cruel. They would tell Marin that the wealthy Thursday regular, the strange, silent man with the endless money, had requested her personally for his private dinner. They would tell her he'd asked for her by name. They would let her believe, for one glorious humiliating evening that a rich man was interested in her. The plain waitress, with the dead parents and the cheap shoes. And then they would watch it fall apart. Because the man never spoke. Because he was, in Bexley's words, broken. Because Marin would sit across a candlelit table from a silent stranger for 2 hours, red-faced and desperate, not knowing what she'd walked into, and the three of them would take turns watching through the service window and passing the phone back and forth. "He won't say a word to her," Bexley said, warming to it. "She'll die. She'll absolutely die. And when she comes out we tell her the truth, that we set it up, that nobody in their right mind would pick her, and maybe then she quits and I get my Thursdays back." Tubin was already thinking about the angle, the lighting, how it would play. "We record it for me. No faces. Nothing that gets us fired. Just the reactions." "For you," Bexley agreed, generous with things that weren't hers. Coralie laughed and clapped her hands like a child, and it was decided. They found Marin at the coat check 20 minutes before service, and Bexley did the talking because Bexley was good at making poison taste like sugar. "Castell, there you are, warm, almost affectionate. Okay, don't freak out. You know the man in the corner? Thursday guy. Corner table. The tall one." She let the pause do work. "He booked the private room tonight, and he asked for you." Marin's hands, folding a stack of napkins, went still. "By name," Bexley pressed, watching her face the way a cat watches a bird. "Wrote it down for the manager. Castell said he wanted the girl who signed to him." She wrinkled her nose as if the last part were a strange, forgivable quirk. "Whatever that means. Point is, it's you. Big table, private room, and a man who tips like the room's on fire. Do not screw this up." Marin's pulse had gone loud in her own ears. The girl who signed to him, she hadn't imagined it. Then he'd seen. He'd remembered. She was not a foolish woman. Some deep instinct, sharpened by years of watching people from the edges of rooms, whispered that this was wrong. That Bexley had never in 3 years handed her a gift. That the smiles at the service bay had teeth. But under the suspicion was something warmer and more dangerous, something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. The small, traitorous flame of being wanted, of being chosen. Even the possibility of it made her chest ache. And there was the other thing, the one that made the choice for her. Rent, Emil's hearing therapy. That insurance wouldn't cover. The stack of red envelopes on the kitchen counter she hadn't let herself open. A man who threw money around the way this one did might, on a single good night, cover a whole month. She couldn't afford to be suspicious. That was the whole trap, and she understood it and stepped into it anyway. Because that is what poverty does. It takes away your right to say no. "Which dress code?" Marin heard herself ask. Bexley's smile widened by a fraction of an inch. Behind her, at the far end of the hall, Tobin lifted his phone and let it rest against a shelf, screen dark, angled at the door of the private dining room. "Wear something nice," Bexley said sweetly. "You'll want to remember tonight." Half an hour later, in a borrowed navy dress with her mother's single good earring in each ear, Marin Castell stood outside the tall paneled doors of the private room with her heart in her throat and no idea at all what waited on the other side. She pressed her damp palms flat against her skirt. She pushed the door open. The private dining room at the Gilded Heron was a different world from the floor. No clatter, no crowd, just a single long table dressed in white linen, a wall of glass looking out over the river and the burning grid of the city, and candlelight that turned everything gold and soft at the edges. At the head of the table sat the man from the corner. He rose when the door opened. That was the first thing that struck Marin, and it struck her hard because in 3 years at the Heron, no guest had ever once stood for her. He was taller than she'd realized, dressed in charcoal, so well cut, it looked poured on, and up close his stillness wasn't cold, the way the others described it. It was watchful, contained, like a held breath. His eyes went straight to her face, and then, she caught it, sheep and half waiting for it, to her mouth. "Good evening," Marin said, too brightly the trained voice of a girl who serves for a living. You requested me." He didn't answer. He studied her lips as she spoke, patient. And then he lifted one hand and touched 2 fingers to his ear, then his mouth, and gave a small, plain shake of his head. "I don't hear," the gesture said, "and I don't use my voice." And there it was, the whole shape of the cruelty her coworkers had built, laid out clean in a single quiet gesture. A silent man. A whole evening of nothing. She was supposed to sit here and drown. Somewhere behind the paneled wall. She knew. They were watching. She could almost feel Bexley's smile through the plaster. Marin looked at this man, at the careful blankness he wore, like a coat, the blankness of someone braced to be pitied or mocked or fled from, and something in her chest turned over. She set down the water pitcher, and she raised her hands. "Good evening," she signed, her fingers clean and sure, the language she'd spoken at her own kitchen table 1,000 nights. "I'm Marin. You asked for the girl who signs." "That's me." The man went absolutely still. For a moment, he simply stared at her hands, as if he did not trust them to be real. Then his gaze lifted to her face, and the blankness cracked, and underneath it was something so raw and so undefended that Marin had to look away for a second to give him privacy with it. It was the face of a person who has spent years underwater and just broken the surface. His hands came up. They were large, scarred across 2 knuckles, and they moved with a fluency that made her own feel small. "You sign." A pause. "You really sign. That night I thought I imagined it." "You didn't." She signed. "I meant it. I hoped you'd enjoyed your meal." Something happened to his face then that she suspected didn't happen often. He smiled. It was slow, and it was real, and it changed him entirely. Took 10 years, and a great deal of ice off of him. All at once. "Sit," he signed. "Please. I've frightened 3 waiters already tonight. I was told the 4th might actually stay." She almost laughed. She caught it in time, remembering the watchers, remembering the phone she was now certain was pointed at this door. A cold thread of caution wound back through her. She did not know this man. She did not know what her coworkers had truly set in motion, only that they'd meant it to hurt. But she sat. "My name is Casimir," he signed. Once she was settled, and the candle stood between them like a small shared fire. "People call me Cass. Almost no one calls me anything, because almost no one can." His mouth twisted. "Wry. You have no idea how loud a silent room can be." "I do, actually." Marin signed. "My brother is deaf. He's 8. Our whole house is quiet, and it's the least quiet place I know." Cass leaned forward a fraction. "A brother." His hands slowed. "Careful. Then you didn't learn this for a job. Or for me." "No," she admitted. "I learned it because I love someone." It was never a party trick. Behind the wall, Marin would learn much later. 3 faces had begun to fall. They had expected paralysis. Panic. A red-faced girl, mouthing hopeless pleasantries at a stone wall of a man while they filmed it for a laugh. What they were watching instead, through the narrow service window, Tobin's phone propped and recording, was 2 people leaning toward each other across candlelight, hands moving in a fast, private, luminous conversation neither of the watchers could read a word of, both of them beginning, unmistakably, to smile. "What are they doing?" Coralie whispered. "She knows it," Tobin breathed, and there was something almost frightened in it. "She knows the hand stuff. She can talk to him." Bexley said nothing. Bexley watched Marin Castell, the church mouse, the girl who never flinched, throw back her head and laugh at something the terrifying silent man had said with his hands. And Bexley felt the plan curdle in her stomach into something that tasted a great deal like humiliation of her own. "This isn't funny anymore," Coralie said. "Keep filming," Bexley snapped. Inside the room, Marin had forgotten them. That was the dangerous thing, the thing she would scold herself for later. For the length of 1 appetizer and half a glass of wine she'd never ordered and could never afford, she forgot the trap entirely. because for the first time in 3 grinding years, someone was truly seeing her. Not the apron, not the service, but her, and answering her in her own hands. And it was like warmth after a long cold. She'd stopped, noticing she was in. "You're not what they said," she signed. Before she could stop herself, Kaz tilted his head. "What did they say?" She hesitated. She should lie. "That you were frightening," she signed instead, because his hand seemed to make lying pointless. "Broken. That no one would want to sit with you." His expression didn't change, but something moved far back in his eyes, cool and assessing, and for the first time she felt the edge underneath the warmth, the sense that this was a man who missed nothing, who had survived by missing nothing. "And yet here you are," he signed slowly. "So either they were wrong, or someone sent you in here expecting you not to last the hour." A pause. His eyes flicked, just once, to the service window and back. "Which is it, Marin?" Her heart stopped. He knew. Or he was one careful question away from knowing. Marin's hands hovered, caught between a lie and the truth, and Cass watched them the way a man watches a coin before it lands. She lowered them. "I don't know exactly," she signed at last honestly. "I only know I was told you asked for me by name, and that the people who told me have never once done me a kindness. So I came in, expecting to be laughed at." She lifted her chin. "I didn't expect you." Cass was quiet, a long moment. Then, instead of anger, she'd braced for anger. He did something that unsettled her far more. He looked, briefly, sad. "I did ask for you by name," he signed. "I asked the manager for the girl who signed to me. I've eaten in silence in that corner for 2 years. You were the first person in this entire city who spoke to me without a pen and paper." His jaw tightened. "I didn't consider that they might use that. That I might be a joke someone could hand you." His hands stilled. "That was careless of me." "I'm not usually careless." The last line landed strangely. "I'm not usually careless." It was said the way another man might say, "I don't usually miss," and Marin felt the floor of the evening shift very slightly beneath her. She was saved from answering by the door. It opened without a knock, which at the Gilded Heron, in a private room, simply did not happen, and a man stepped in. He was younger than Cass, built like a door, in a suit that was trying and failing to look like it belonged in a restaurant rather than a doorway you didn't get past. He crossed to Cass, bent close, and held a phone out, screen up, so Cass could read what was on it. Marin watched Casimir Voronin read whatever was on that screen, and she watched the warmth drain out of him like water out of a cracked glass. What was left was flat, and cold, and very, very calm, and it frightened her more than shouting ever could. Cass's hands moved, not to her, to the man. Sharp, economical signs the big man clearly understood, and the man nodded once and withdrew as silently as he'd come. But before the door closed, Marin saw the way he moved his jacket to reach his pocket, and she saw, for half a second, the dark shape of the holster beneath his arm. Her mouth went dry. Cass turned back to her, and by the time he faced her the warmth had been deliberately put back on, like a mask reapplied. But she'd seen underneath now, and they both knew it. "I'm sorry," he signed. "Business. It follows me everywhere." "What kind of business?" Marin signed carefully. "Travels with a man who carries a gun to dinner." The candle flame stood very straight between them. Kaz looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense of being weighed, not judged, weighed, the way you weigh whether a person can carry a thing before you hand it to them. "The honest answer will change how you look at me," he signed. "The night was going well. I'd like it to keep going a little longer before I ruin it." "I've had a lot of things ruined," Marin signed. "I'd rather know the shape of a thing than trip over it in the dark." That earned her another of those rare, real, transforming looks. Respect. This time. "All right." Kaz signed. "Not everything, but this much." His hands slowed, deliberate, giving her time to stop him. "The building we're sitting in, the company that owns it belongs to me through 4 other names. There are parts of this city that run on money. that moves through rooms like this one, quietly, and a great deal of that money answers to me. Men carry guns near me because there are men who would very much like me to stop breathing, and some of them are patient, and some of them are not. Marin sat very still. The borrowed dress felt suddenly thin. "You're a criminal," she signed. It wasn't an accusation. It was a girl naming the size of the thing in the room. "I'm a lot of ugly words," Cass answered evenly. "That's one of the truer ones." He watched her face. "This is the part where the smart ones leave, Marin. I'll pay you for the whole night, regardless. I'll have you driven home. No one will trouble you a beat. I'd think less of you if you stayed, and more of you if you ran." And that the last line, offered plainly, no trick in it, was what kept her in the chair. Because a man who wanted to trap her would not have handed her the key. "My brother is waiting up for me," Marin signed slowly. "I have exactly enough money to get us to Friday. I came in here tonight because I couldn't afford not to, and I stayed, because you're the first person in 3 years who looked at me like I was a person, and not a tray." Her hands were shaking slightly. She made them steady. "I'm not going to pretend that a gun in the room doesn't scare me, but I've been scared every single day for 3 years, for far worse reasons than you. So I think I'll finish my dinner." Casimir Voronin looked at her as if she had done something extraordinary. And behind the wall, unseen by either of them, Tobin's phone kept recording, its little red light steady capturing, without understanding a single sign of it, the moment a mafia boss decided that the waitress her coworkers had sent to be humiliated was the most interesting person he had met in 10 years. What none of them yet knew was that the message on the big man's phone, the one that had turned Kaz to ice, had a name on it, and that the name was about to walk straight into the Gilded Heron. His name was Lazar, the big man at the door, and he came back into the private room 11 minutes later, and this time he did not bother to knock or to whisper. He crossed straight to Cass and held up the phone, and Marin, seated close now, could read the screen before Cass covered it. 3 words, all capitals. "There, here, front, Cass Rose." It was not the polite half-rise he'd given her at the door. It was a slow, unfolding movement that seemed to fill the room, and every trace of the warm man who'd made her laugh over her hands was gone. In his place stood something that made Lazar, a man built like a loading dock, take a half step back and drop his eyes. "Stay here," Cass signed to Marin, "fast. Whatever happens, this room has 1 door, and I'm putting Lazar on it. You do not open it. Do you understand me? What's happening?" Marin signed, on her feet now too, heart slamming. "Someone I owe a conversation decided to have it tonight." Cass signed grimly. "Poor timing." Or very good timing, depending who arranged it. His eyes narrowed, and she saw the thought cross his face like a shadow, the same thought that had been forming, cold, in her own gut for the last several minutes. Because who books a private room and requests a specific waitress? And how does an enemy know, on that exact night, exactly where to find a man who trusts no one and varies his every movement? Someone had told them where he'd be. Someone at the Gilded Heron, Kaz. Marin signed, and her hands were unsteady now, for a wholly new reason. "The people who set me up tonight, the ones who told me you asked for me, they knew you'd be here. They booked this room around you. They've been watching us through that window the entire night. Filming." Kaz went very still. "Filming," he signed. "For a joke." Marin signed, miserably. "To humiliate me. But they know your face. They know this room. And if the wrong people paid the right coworker of mine to make a phone call," she didn't finish. She didn't have to. She watched Casimir Voronin arrive at the same terrible arithmetic she had, and she watched him understand that the childish cruelty aimed at one broke waitress, and the loaded threat now standing in the lobby of his own restaurant, might be 2 ends of the very same string. For one suspended second, the two of them simply stared at each other across the candlelight, the prank and the ambush, folding together into a single shape, and the whole meaning of the night turned over like a coin coming down on its other face. Then Cass moved. He crossed to the wall to the narrow service window her coworkers had been peering through, and he opened the little panel with one hard pull. On the other side, frozen, caught, stood Bexley, with a wine glass halfway to her mouth, Coralie with both hands over her own, and Tobin, with his phone still up, still recording, its red light blinking guiltily in the sudden shaft of candlelight. The three of them looked into the face of the silent man they had spent all night laughing at, and found nothing silent about it at all. Kaz didn't need to hear to make himself understood. He looked at the phone, he looked at Tobin. And he smiled, a smile with no warmth anywhere in it. The smile of a man who has just been handed, gift-wrapped, the exact thing he needed and the exact people responsible. Then he reached through the little window, unhurried, and closed his scarred hand around the top of Tobin's phone. Tobin didn't let go. Some animal instinct, some idea that the phone was his, and this was still, somehow, a joke he was in charge of. For half a second, the two of them held it between them through the narrow gap in the wall, the boy and the man, and then Cass simply looked at him, and Tobin's fingers opened one at a time, as if they'd stopped belonging to him. Case turned the phone over in his palm. The red light still blinked. He didn't stop the recording. That, Marin understood, with a chill, was deliberate. He wanted whatever came next on it. "Please," Bexley said through the window, and it was the first honest word Marin had ever heard her say. The charm was gone. What was left was small and white-faced. "Please, we didn't. It was a joke. It was just a stupid joke about her." She pointed at Marin as if that would help, as if handing Marin over might buy something back. "We didn't know who you were." Cass watched her mouth move. He read every word of it. And then he set the phone down flat on the sill, screen up, camera still running, and he signed, slowly, so that Marin would have to be the one to speak it aloud, so that the truth would come out in the voice of the girl they'd tried to break. "Tell them what I'm saying," he signed to Marin. "Word for word. I want them to hear it from you." Marin's throat was dry. But she looked at the three faces crowded in that little window. Bexley, who had smiled while she baited the trap. Coralie, who laughed at everything and stopped nothing. Tobin, who filmed it all for strangers. And she found that her voice, when it came, was steady. "He says," Marin translated, watching his hands, "that you spent the whole night filming a man you thought couldn't understand you." His hands moved. "He says you were half right. He can't hear you." Another phrase. "But he has never in his life had any trouble understanding people like you." Coralie made a small sound. Tobin had gone the color of the tablecloth. "Tell them the last part." Cass signed, and there was something almost gentle in it, which was the most frightening thing of all. Marin swallowed. "He says," she went on, "that the joke worked. That someone in this building is going to be very sorry tonight." Her hands felt cold. "He just doesn't think it's going to be me." For a long, ringing moment, no one in the little window moved. And then, from 3 floors below them, muffled by the glass and the distance, came a sound that reached even the silent room by way of the tremor it sent through the floor. The heavy double thud of the Gilded Heron's front doors being thrown open all at once. Lazar's head snapped toward the stairs. His hand went inside his jacket. Downstairs, 4 men who had not come to eat walked in out of the rain, shaking the water from their coats, and the maitre d', who tried to greet them, was moved aside with one arm like a turnstile. Cass read the change in Lazar's body before anyone said a word. "They're early," he signed, and for the first time all night, Casimir Voronin looked not cold, but concerned. "That means someone downstairs is already down, or about to be." His eyes found Marin's, and whatever he'd meant to say next, he changed it. "Get behind me," he signed. "Now." Marin moved behind Cass without arguing, and she was ashamed of how easily her body obeyed the instinct, how quickly, after one night, she had decided this dangerous stranger was the safest thing in the room. Lazar had the door. He'd drawn the pistol from under his arm and held it low against his leg, and he was speaking fast and quiet into a collar mic, and Marin realized with a lurch that the big man's job tonight had never been the door of a restaurant. It had been Cass. Everything about the evening, the private room with its single entrance and its clean sightlines, the cash payment, the man built like a wall standing just outside, none of it was the eccentricity of a rich recluse. It was the standing operational caution of a man who expected, on any given night, that someone might come for him. She heard the stairwell door bang open 3 floors down. She heard shouting she couldn't make out. And then she heard the sound that turned her legs to water. 3 flat, ugly cracks, too quick and too dry to be anything but gunfire, swallowed almost at once by the thick carpet and thicker walls of a restaurant built for people who did not want to hear each other. Cass felt none of it. That was the thing Marin would never forget. That through all of it, the man in front of her stood in a pocket of absolute silence, reading the danger not with his ears but with everything else. He watched Lazar's shoulders. He watched the vibration of the floor. He watched. She realized. Her flinch at each shot was information, telling him how close, how many, how fast. How many came up? He signed to Lazar without looking away from the stairs. Lazar flashed 4 fingers, then a flat palm, 4, holding. Cass's hands moved once. Sharp. Hours. 6. In the building. Lazar mouthed carefully so Cass could read it. 8 more, 2 minutes out. And there it was. The whole truth of Casimir Voronin, laid bare in a single exchange. The 4 men who had walked in out of the rain to finish him had walked into a building that already held more of his guns than theirs. Because a man who lived braced for the knife did not sit down to dinner anywhere. The ambush was not an ambush. It was 4 men stepping into a closed hand. It was over in under 90 seconds. Marin heard it end more than saw it. A last short exchange, a heavy fall, then a silence broken only by low voices and the small domestic sound, absurd in the moment, of a dropped tray somewhere far below. Lazar listened to his caller, then turned and gave Cass a single nod. 3 down, he signed for Cass. 1 breathing. We have him. Cass let out a slow breath. Only then did he turn to Marin, and the cold command in his face gentled by a degree when he found her still on her feet, white, but not screaming. You're all right, he signed. It wasn't quite a question. No. Marin signed back honestly, and surprised a flicker of something. Respect, again, onto his face. It was Bexley who broke. She came out of the service alcove, into the main room, and the elegant senior server, who had spent 9 years being charming to anyone with money or power, was gone. In her place was a shaking woman, who had just heard the gunfire fall silent 3 floors below, and understood that the joke she'd built had ended in something no one could take back. They came for him, she said, her voice climbing. They came here, with guns, because of... She stopped. Her eyes went to Tobin and something shifted in her face, from terror to a horrible dawning accusation. The clips, she whispered. Tobin, your clips. Marin turned. So did Kaz, reading Bexley's mouth, then following her stare, to the boy still frozen by the window with his empty hands. What clips? Marin said, very quietly. Tobin's mouth worked. It was just content, he stammered. The mystery guy, the silent millionaire. People loved him. It was my best. I never used his name. I didn't know his name. He was crying. Now snot and panic. I posted where I worked. I posted he came Thursdays. I posted tonight there was a big thing, a VIP in the private room. He looked like he might be sick. It was for views. And Marin understood, cold to the bone, exactly what her coworkers had actually done. For weeks. To grow a following he cared about more than any human being, Tobin had been broadcasting a man who had spent 2 silent years making himself invisible, filming him, tagging the restaurant, mapping his habits to strangers on the internet. Somewhere in that audience of strangers had been eyes that recognized Casimir for Ronan, and those eyes had waited for the night Tobin himself announced for a laugh. Exactly where the invisible man would be sitting, and when. The prank meant to humiliate. One broke waitress had drawn a map to a hidden king and mailed it to his enemies. Cass watched all of this land on the three white faces. He did not look angry anymore. He looked tired, and old, and certain, like a man reading the last line of a letter he'd always known was coming. "Bring them," he signed to Lazar, nodding at the coworkers. "All three, and the survivor." His eyes moved to Marin, and his hands slowed. Gentle now in a way that frightened her more than the gunfire had. "And her, she doesn't go home tonight. Not to that address. Not until I know how deep this runs." Marin signed, though her hands already knew. Cass met her eyes, because whoever bought those clips, he signed, now knows the face of the only person in this city who can speak for me. And there is a small deaf boy asleep at that address who cannot hear them come through the door. They drove out of the city in a low black car with Lazar at the wheel, and Marin spent the first 10 minutes of it unable to breathe. She had called her neighbor from Cass's phone the instant his words landed. "There's a boy at that address," and it was the longest 90 seconds of her life, until old Mrs. Endius. Pharaoh picked up sleepy and confused and confirmed that Emile was fine, asleep, that nothing was wrong. Cass had already sent 2 of his men to sit outside the building before the call even connected. By the time Marin hung up, shaking, a second car was pulling up to her curb across the city to bring her brother out. "He'll be brought somewhere safe." Cass signed to her in the dark of the back seat, the city lights sliding gold across his face. "Not to me. Somewhere quiet, with people I trust with my own life. You'll be with him within the hour. You have my word, and I don't spend it often." Marin looked at this man, this criminal, this stranger, this island of stillness, who had undone 4 people's worth of intention tonight without lifting a hand, and found, to her horror, that she believed him completely. "Why?" she signed. "You met me 3 hours ago. Why does any of this cost you a second thought?" Cass was quiet for a while, watching the road. He couldn't hear. "Because you signed to me," he said finally. "Do you understand what that is to me? I lost my hearing at 6. Meningitis. My father ran what I run now, and he decided a deaf son was a broken tool, so he handed me to the back rooms and forgot my name. I learned to sign from a janitor who felt sorry for me. I learned everything else by watching mouths, and reading rooms, and being so still that men forgot I was there and said things they shouldn't." His hands were steady, but there was an old wound under them. "They called me broken my whole life, Marin. Your coworkers only said out loud what I've heard behind every hand in every room for 30 years. And then a waitress in a borrowed dress lifted her fingers and spoke to me like I was a person, and asked nothing back." He looked at her. "Do you know how long it had been?" Marin's throat ached. "No, neither do I," Cass signed. "I stopped counting." She told him her own then. She didn't decide to. It simply came out, the way blood comes out when the pressure is finally off a wound. She told him about the wet road and the delivery truck and the phone call at 2 a.m. 3 years ago. About being 23, half a degree from a life she'd wanted, signing away that life instead, on a guardianship form, with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. About Emile, who'd been 5, who'd asked her every night for a month when their parents were coming back, and how she'd had to find a way to sign, never to a child who trusted her hands completely. She told him about the money. The therapy insurance called optional. The rent that ate everything. The red envelopes on the counter she couldn't open because opening them made the numbers real. The kitchen mistakes she ate off the return tray. The good dress that had been her mother's, let out twice, worn tonight because it was the only armor she owned against a night she'd been promised would break her. She told him the part she'd never said out loud to anyone, that some nights, after Emile was asleep and the numbers had been beaten back for one more day, she would sit on the fire escape and let herself imagine, for exactly the length of one cigarette she didn't smoke, a life where she'd finished her degree, where the phone hadn't rung at 2 a.m. Where she was someone other than the sum of what a child needed. And then she would put the imagining away, carefully, like a photograph, too painful to keep out, and go back inside and do it all again, not because she was a saint, because Emil's hands lit up when she came through the door, and there was no accounting in which that wasn't worth everything. Everyone at that restaurant thinks they have me, figured. She signed. Poor, sad Costel. They're not wrong, exactly. I am poor, I am tired, but they think that makes me small. Her hands firmed. I have kept a child alive and laughing for 3 years on tips and spite. There's nothing small about me, I just can't afford to let it show. Cass looked at her for a long moment in the passing light. No, he signed softly. There isn't. And I don't think anyone has told you that in a very long time. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was not empty, the particular full silence Marin knew. From her own kitchen table, the silence of two people who didn't need sound to be understood. The safe house was a farmhouse an hour out, warm-windowed against the dark, and when the second car pulled in behind them and a small, tousled shape in mismatched pajamas came bolting across the gravel, Marin was out and on her knees in the wet before the car had stopped. Emil hit her like a small comet. His hands were already flying. Where were you, Mrs. Bull? Pharaoh said, cars. A man signed to me. Marin, a man, signed to me in the car. Are we on an adventure? And Marin held his face and laughed and cried at the same time and signed yes. An adventure? You're safe. I've got you against his hair. When she looked up, Kaz was standing a little apart, watching the boy's hands the way a starving man watches a window. And Emil, catching sight of the tall stranger, did not shrink. He studied Cass the way deaf children study anyone, reading the whole body at once, and then his small hands rose, shy and hopeful and clear. Are you the man who signs? Kaz went down on one knee in the gravel, slowly, so as not to frighten him, and answered in hands that had not shaped a sentence for a child in decades. I am, he signed, and you must be the reason your sister speaks so beautifully. Marin, kneeling in the cold with her brother's hand in hers, and this impossible man before them both felt something in her chest that she had refused to feel for 3 years, finally, quietly, give way. By morning, Casimir Voronin had decided several things, and Casimir Voronin was not a man who decided things twice. Marin learned this the way she was beginning to learn everything about him, by watching what he did rather than waiting for him to say it. She came down into the farmhouse kitchen at dawn, having finally slept an hour with a meal tucked against her, and found Cass already there, with Lazar and a laptop and the flat-banked calm of a man who had been awake and working while the house slept. He slid a phone across the table to her without a word. On the screen was a photograph of a man she didn't know, heavy, silver-ringed, smiling at some party, and beneath it, a name, Dragomir Sarkany. The man who sent the four, Cass signed. Once she looked up. We call him Drago. He spent 2 years trying to take the ports and the roots out from under me, one careful piece at a time. Last night he tried to take my life instead. His jaw set. He'd have managed it, eventually, if a bartender chasing strangers' attention hadn't accidentally handed him the timing. The one your men took alive, Marin signed. Did he talk? All night, Kaz answered, and something grim moved behind his eyes. He gave us Drago's name freely. He was hired muscle, paid in cash, glad to trade it for his own skin. But that's all he had. He didn't know how they found me, or who told them the room and the rotation. Men like him are handed a time and a door and pointed at it. His hands slowed. Which means the person who actually opened that door for Drago is still somewhere close to me, and still thinks I don't know they exist. That's the one who matters. That's the one I can't find. What happens now? Marin signed. And Cass told her. And it was the moment she understood exactly what kind of man had knelt in her brother's blood. No, not blood. In the gravel, for her brother. She kept confusing the two, the tenderness and the violence, because in him they lived in the same body without apology. He was going to end it, not manage it, not survive it, end it. Drago had broken the one rule that had kept the city's ugly peace. He had come for Cass in the open, in a room full of civilians, and in doing so he had put a child Cass had knelt for into harm's way. That, Cass signed, could not be answered with anything except the removal of Dragomir Sarkani from the world. There was no version of the next month where both men were alive at the end of it. He had made his choice the instant the four came up the stairs. But that was not the part that made it a point of no return. That was just war. And Cass had been at war his whole life. The part that could not be undone was this. You and Emil are not going back. He signed. Not to that apartment. Not to that restaurant. Not to that life where one bad week ends. You. He said it plainly, without heat, the way he said everything. I've paid the envelopes on your counter. All of them. The therapy your brother needs is scheduled and covered for as long as he needs it. The lease is closed. My people emptied the apartment last night. A pause. I did it before I asked you, and I know what that is. You can be angry. But I won't apologize for it, because I've spent one night watching you. And I already know you'd have spent that money on him and gone hungry yourself, and I am not built to watch that happen twice. Marin stared at him. 3 years of ground down, white-knuckled survival. The debt, the fear, the arithmetic that ran behind her eyes every waking second, lifted off her shoulders so suddenly she felt the room tilt. She should have been furious. He'd rearranged her entire life without her permission, the way powerful men do. You can't just decide my life for me, she signed, because it needed saying. I know, Cass answered. I decided the money. The rest is yours. He held her eyes. You can take Emil somewhere. I'll never find you, and I'll make sure you're safe getting there, and you'll never see me again. Or you can stay, and be part of a world that will not be gentle, but will never once let you go hungry or invisible again. His hands slowed. I won't dress it up. I'm not a good man, Marin, but I would be a careful one, with you. That's the most honest thing I own. It was not a proposal. It was something raw and more dangerous, an offer laid flat on the table with nothing hidden under it, from a man who hid everything. She should have been afraid. A sensible woman would have taken the safe exit he was holding open, would have grabbed her brother and vanished into some small ordinary town, and never looked back at the man with the split knuckles and the private army. She turned the choice over and found, underneath the fear, the thing that surprised her most. She did not want the small ordinary town. She had spent 3 years being small and ordinary and terrified, invisible in a black apron, and it had nearly killed her by inches. What Cass was offering wasn't safety exactly. It was the end of being unseen. Marin thought of the return tray, the red envelopes, the years of being measured and dismissed, and she thought of Emil, last night, signing MAN, signed to me, with his whole face lit up, safe for the first time in a house that wasn't hers. She thought of how the boy had slept, really slept, boneless and open-mouthed, a child who for one night did not have to be brave. She didn't answer, with her hands. She reached across the table and turned Cass's scarred palm face up, and she laid her own hand flat against it. The first time in all of it, she had reached for him instead of merely speaking to him across the candlelight. Then we stay, she signed against his skin. But you don't decide us, you ask. Every time, for the first time since she'd met him, Casimir Voronin looked like a man who had won something he hadn't dared to want. And that was the morning the waitress her coworkers had tried to break stopped running, and the deaf king who'd been alone for 30 years stopped counting, and the two of them turned, together, to the far more dangerous business of everyone who had ever mistaken them for weak. The stronghold was not what Marin had pictured. It was a converted mill on a hill an hour past the farmhouse, all old stone and new steel, and for 2 days it became the strangest home she had ever known. a fortress full of quiet men who signed clumsy hellos to Emil because their boss had made it known. Emil bloomed there. That was the thing that undid Marin a little more each hour. For 3 years her brother had lived in a hearing world that treated him like a problem to be managed. And here was a house where the most powerful man in it spoke his language, where Cass would break off from grim conversations with grimmer men to answer Emil's endless questions about the horses in the field and whether the stone tower had ghosts. Cass was patient with the boy in a way. He was with no one else. Marin caught them one afternoon, sitting on the steps. Cass teaching Emil the sign for falcon, as a real one wheeled overhead, and she had to go back inside so neither of them would see her face. But under the warmth, the house hummed with a colder problem, and by the second night, Marin could feel Cass circling it like a wolf that couldn't find the throat. "Something doesn't fit," he signed to her, late. The two of them alone in the room he used as an office, maps and photographs pinned to the old brick. Tobin's clips gave Drago my face and my Thursdays. Fine. But the private room was booked that morning, in cash, off my books. The security rotation on that floor was thin, that night, for reasons only 4 of my people knew. Drago came up those stairs knowing exactly how many men I had and exactly where they weren't. His jaw was tight. The clips got him interested. Someone inside got him in the door. "You have a leak," Marin signed. "I've had my best people looking for 2 days," Cass answered. "Every man who knew the rotation checks clean. Phones, movements, everything. There's nothing." Marin looked at the wall of surveillance photos and rotation charts, and something in her that had spent 3 years reading the true shape of things through their disguises stirred awake. "You're all looking at the same thing," she signed slowly. Who could tell him? "Loyalty, movements, phones," she turned to Cass. "Nobody's looking at the money." Cass frowned. Meaning a man doesn't feed an enemy for 2 years out of love." Marin signed. Her hands were sure now, moving with the certainty of the one subject she'd been forced to master. He does it for money. And money never disappears. People just stop looking at it carefully because it's boring. I spent 3 years knowing to the cent what I had, because being off by $10 meant my brother went without. I can read a column of numbers the way you read a room. She lifted her chin. "Let me see your books. Not the clean ones, the real ones, the ones that made all this." For a long moment, Cass simply looked at her, a waitress, 2 days into his world, asking to see the ledgers that were the beating heart of everything he owned. Lazar, in the doorway, made a low sound of objection. Cass ignored him. He crossed to the safe, and he opened it, and he set the true accounts of his empire in front of the woman her coworkers had sent to be humiliated. It was, Marin understood, the most naked act of trust he had ever committed. He was handing her the knife that could gut him. She worked through the night. Cass brought her a mug of coffee, scalding and unsweetened, exactly the way she'd mentioned once in passing that she took it. And she almost laughed at how closely he'd been paying attention. Emil slept in the next room. The numbers spread across the desk and into Marin's tired, relentless mind, and slowly, the way a face emerges from static, the shadow took shape. It was strange work, and she fell into it the way she hadn't fallen into anything in years. The way she imagined other people fell into music or the sea. Kaz's men had built the accounts to be read by people who trusted them. Every entry assumed good faith, because everyone who touched them had been vouched for a decade deep. Marin read them the way she'd read her own life for 3 years, assuming the worst, checking every number against the story it claimed to tell, hunting for the $10 that shouldn't be there, because the $10 had always been the difference between eating and not. She had learned to distrust numbers in the hardest possible school, and now that suspicion, which had felt for so long like a curse, turned out to be the one key in the city that fit this particular lock. Cass didn't hover. He sat across from her with his own work, the two of them in a pool of lamplight in the old brick room, and every so often she'd feel him watching her hands move across the pages and glance up to find something unguarded in his face. A man watching someone do effortlessly the thing his whole organization had failed at, and understanding, slowly, what he'd nearly thrown away with the driver home and a night's pay. It was small, it was patient, it was taught, she thought with grudging respect, the work of someone very good, who had counted on no one ever looking because no one ever had. A maintenance contract that renewed a little too richly. A shipping tariff routed through a broker who took a fee that went nowhere real. Sums too small to notice, bled steadily, for 2 years, pooling at last in a single account that had gone quiet 3 days before Drago's men climbed the stairs. Quiet the way a thing goes quiet, right before it moves. She traced the account back through 4 false names to the one hand that had signed off on every one of the diversions. The one person trusted enough to move that money without a second signature, for 15 years, without question. When she finally sat back, gray with exhaustion, and turned the ledger toward Cass and pointed at the name, she watched something break in his face that no gunfire had touched all night. The name was Anselm. My consigliere cause, signed very slowly, as if the sign itself hurt his hands. 15 years. He carried my father's coffin. He taught me which forks to fear at the tables where they smiled and plotted against me. His hands dropped. Anselm. I'm sorry. Marin signed. Cass stared at the name a long time. Then he lifted his eyes to her, and where she expected grief, she found instead that terrible banked calm again. The stillness of the man in the candlelit room, deciding a thing he would not decide twice. Don't be, he signed. You just did in one night what my whole house couldn't do in 2 years. Something moved behind his eyes, cold and clear. He fed me to Drago, because he spent 15 years, certain a deaf man couldn't truly see. He was wrong about the one thing that was going to be his undoing. Cass closed the ledger, and so was everyone else who ever underestimated the quiet ones in this story. They came for the small reckonings first, before the large one. Cass had held Bexley, Tobin, and Coralie for 2 days, in a way that was technically not imprisonment and felt like nothing else. A clean room, food, no doors that opened from the inside, and no explanation. When Marin walked in on the 3rd morning, all 3 of them flinched, and it was Bexley, always Bexley, who broke the silence, because terror had scrubbed the charm off her right down to the bone. Please, she said, Castell, Marin, whatever they're going to, you can tell them. We didn't mean it. It was a joke. We didn't know he was. That, any of this, I know exactly what you meant, Marin said quietly, and something in her voice, some new steel 2 days in this world had put there, closed Bexley's mouth. You meant to make me small. To film a poor girl sitting across from a man you'd decided was broken, so you could all watch her drown and feel large for a night. She looked at each of them in turn. You didn't know he owned the building. You didn't know he ran half the dark in this city, and you definitely didn't know that a boy chasing strangers' attention online had mailed that man's location to people who came to the restaurant with guns. Tobin made a small, wretched sound. 3 men lost their lives on the stairs of the Gilded Heron because you wanted content, Marin went on. Relentless now, level. The people who sent them don't leave witnesses. Which means the 3 of you have been, for 2 days, the safest you will ever be in your lives, because you've been under the roof of the only man powerful enough to make Dragomir Sarkany decide you're not worth the trouble. The silence in the room was total. Here is what happens, Marin said. You will never work in this city again. That's already done. Every room that matters has your names. Tobin, your account is gone, and so is every clip you ever made of him, scrubbed from every server it touched, because that footage is the only thing that ever put us in danger, and it will not exist. You will go somewhere far and small and quiet, and you will be grateful every single day that the man you tried to make a joke of decided you were too small to bother with. She stepped closer and lowered her voice, and this part she meant with her whole chest. You tried to teach me what I was, so let me return the lesson. I am the person who just decided whether you live. Remember that the next time you look at someone you've decided is beneath you." She turned and walked out, and she did not look back, and behind her she heard Bexley begin, quietly, to cry. And Marin found, a little to her own surprise, that she felt neither triumph nor pity. Just the clean, level, nothing of a debt correctly settled. Kaz had offered her their disappearance. She had chosen their smallness instead. It was, she thought, the more honest justice, and the one she could live beside. Kaz was waiting for her in the corridor. He'd watched the whole thing through the glass, reading her mouth, and whatever he'd seen in it had put a look on his face she was still learning to name. "You could have had them gone," he signed. Not a challenge, a genuine question, from a man to whom disappearance was simply a tool on the shelf. "I know," Marin signed. "I didn't want to become someone who reaches for that. Not on my second week. Not ever, if I can help it." She held his eyes. "You handed me that choice to see what I'd do with it, didn't you?" Cass didn't deny it. "I hand people a great deal of rope," he signed, "and I watch what they tie with it. You built something I can trust." A pause, and something almost like relief moved behind his eyes. "Most people build a noose and don't even notice." Anselm was the larger reckoning, and it was not hers. They took him at his own home, at dusk, without noise, the way Cass did everything. Marin wasn't there, but Lazar told her after, in his blunt way, because she'd earned it. The consigliere hadn't run. He'd poured 2 glasses of the good brandy and set one across the desk for Kaz, as if 15 years bought a conversation. Cass didn't sit. He set the ledger on the desk, Marin's ledger. The diversions circled in her careful hand, and he watched Anselm read his own ruin, and he waited. "Why?" Cass signed, when the older man finally looked up. "Just that." And Anselm, who had carried Cass's father's coffin, told him, not with fear, with something worse, a tired old contempt he'd apparently held for years, that he'd run the real machine while Cass played king. That a deaf man could not command respect from the men who mattered, only fear, and fear rots. That Drago had simply offered him what he'd always deserved and never been given. "I built this," Anselm signed, bitter to the last. "You only inherited it, and you couldn't even hear it running." Lazar said Cass let the older man empty himself out completely. Every year of resentment, every private slight, the whole rotten ledger of a proud man who decided that because he could speak, and his boss could not, the wrong one of them was in charge. Kaz didn't interrupt. He'd spent a lifetime letting people believe he missed things, letting them talk past him, letting them reveal exactly who they were. In the belief that the quiet man couldn't follow, he let Anselm do it, one last time. And when the confession curdled at the end into a kind of pleading, 15 years. "Casimir, that has to be worth my life." Cass simply watched the words form and did not blink. Lazar said Cass read every word and did not flinch. And when Anselm finished, Cass signed only one thing back. "You spent 15 years beside me," he signed, "and you still thought hearing was the same as understanding. That's why you lost." Anselm gave them Drago, everything. The meeting he'd brokered for the following night, where Drago believed he'd be receiving Cass's severed operation from a triumphant traitor. The location, the numbers, the trap that had been built for Cass handed, now wire by wire, to the man it was meant to catch. Tomorrow night, Cass signed to Marin, back at the mill. The maps were pinned into something new and final. "Drago thinks he's meeting Anselm to split what's left of me." His eyes were very dark. "He's going to meet me instead." The meeting was set for a shuttered freight depot on the north edge of the water, the kind of dead industrial place where sound went to die, which Marin thought, when Cass told her, was a bleakly perfect stage for a man who lived without it. She fought him on going, she lost, and she won, in equal measure. She would not be at the depot. Emil needed her alive and whole, And she needed to be the one thing in Cass's life he never had to worry about mid-fight, but she refused to sit an hour away in ignorance. So she waited in the car at the cordon with Lazar's second, a headset in her hand, close enough to feel it, far enough to survive it. It was the compromise of two people learning to ask instead of decide. Emile was at the farmhouse with Mrs. Seta. Pharaoh, who had been quietly moved into their new life, the way Kaz moved everything he decided to keep, completely and without asking permission of the world. Marin had signed goodnight to her brother over a video call, an hour before back soon, sleep, I love you, and had made her face calm for him, the way she'd made it calm for 3 years, and then she'd sat in the dark car and let the calm fall off it. Her hands would not stop moving in her lap. She realized after a while that they were signing the same word over and over, without her telling them to. Safe, 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 the way another woman might pray. The plan Anselm had given up was elegant, and Cass had turned it inside out with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime being handed other people's certainty and quietly using it against them. Drago believed he was walking into his own trap, sprung on someone else. He believed Anselm had lured Kaz to the depot, and that he, Drago, was arriving to collect a surrender he'd already won. So Kaz gave him the stage exactly as promised. The dead building, the single hanging light, the sweating traitor at its center, and simply arrived first, 6 hours first, and filled the darkness above the light with his own patient men. The trap was real, only the prey had been changed. Drago came expecting Anselm, and a triumph. He came fat with confidence and light on caution. 3 cars and a dozen men, because why bring an army to accept a surrender? He walked into the depot's cavernous dark, under a single hanging worklight, and he found Anselm, waiting for him at the center of it exactly as arranged, pale, sweating, standing very still. What Drago did not see, in the black steel bones of the building all around him, were the 24 silent men who had been in position for 6 hours. Kaz had learned that trick in his father's back rooms 30 years ago. Be so still the powerful forget you're there, and let them keep talking until they've said the thing that ends them. Drago said it. Expansive, laughing, he clapped the trembling Anselm on the shoulder and spoke the words that Marin, listening on the headset a quarter-mile away, would remember for the rest of her life, that it had almost been a shame. Taking down a man who couldn't even hear it coming, that he'd half expected more from the great Voronin, that the deaf man and his little waitress could at least die knowing they'd been beaten by someone who'd been paying attention. That was when Casimir Voronin stepped into the light. He did not come with a gun raised. He came the way he'd risen from the dinner table on the first night, slow, unfolding, filling the space, and the laughter died in Drago's throat as a dozen red points of light settled, silent, across his men from the darkness above. You've been paying attention, Cass signed, and Anselm bought one last time, by his own life, to be the voice. Translated it aloud in a shaking whisper, but you were listening for the wrong thing. You listened for a man who couldn't hear you coming. Cass's hands moved, cold and even. You never once considered a man who's spent his whole life watching you. Drago went for his gun. He was not slow. But he was a man who had spent his life relying on his ears to tell him where the danger was, and the danger tonight made no sound at all. For one heartbeat, the depot held its breath, the traitor frozen in the light, the fat confident man clawing for his weapon, the deaf king standing open-handed in the center of it, as if he'd forgotten how to be afraid. Marin gripped the headset so hard, the plastic bit her palm. And for that single suspended second, she was certain, with a cold that went to the bone, that she had done all this arithmetic only to lose him at the end of it. Then the darkness moved. It came from above and from the sides, from the men who'd been so still for 6 hours that the depot had forgotten them, and it was not a battle so much as a closing. The shutting of a hand that had been open just long enough to let Drago walk all the way inside it. Two of Drago's men got shots off into the dark. Wild, deafening, hitting nothing but the steel bones of the building. The rest never cleared their coats. Kaz himself moved once, low and fast, out of the light and behind cover, before Drago's barrel had finished rising, because a man who cannot hear a gunshot learns very young to be somewhere else before it comes. Marin did not hear the end of it clearly, a short, final exchange, over almost before it began, the depot swallowing the noise the way it swallowed everything. She heard Lazar's voice come flat and final over the headset. Clear. It's done. Anselm did not walk out either. Marin never asked exactly how that part ended, and no one ever offered, and she understood, without being told, that some debts in that world were not settled with exile, the way she'd settled hers with the Coworkers. Anselm had traded 15 years of a boy's trust to a man who'd called that boy worthless in the dark. There was no diner 2 states away for that. She made her peace with the not knowing, and she did not pretend the man she loved was gentle. She had never once let herself pretend that. Then, a moment later, came the only words she'd been truly waiting for, in Cass's men's rough relay of his signs. Tell her I'm walking out. Tell her it's over. Tell her to take the boy home. Home, she noticed the word. He'd never used it before. When they let her through the cordon, and Kaz came out of that dead building into the wet night air alive, unhurt, his knuckles split, and his eyes, finally, fully quiet. Marin did not run to him the way Emile had run to her on the gravel. She walked. She walked right up to the most feared man in the city, and she took his ruined hand in both of hers, and she turned it over and pressed her palm flat against it, and neither of them signed a single thing, because there was nothing left in either language that needed saying. Dragomir Sarkani had spent his life listening for the sound of a threat. He never once looked at the quiet ones. The Gilded Heron closed within the year. Nobody was surprised. A restaurant where 3 men had lost their lives on the stairs was never going to keep its shine, and the ownership, which had changed hands quietly to a company behind 4 other names, seemed strangely unbothered about letting it fade. Marin drove past it once, months later, on her way to somewhere better, and felt nothing at all. The girl who had counted tips in that stairwell had been someone else's life. Her own life, now, was almost unrecognizable, and she was still learning to trust it. Amal went to a real school, a school built for deaf children, where he was not a problem to be managed, but a boy among boys who all spoke with their hands, and he came home each day with so much to tell her that dinner ran long every night. His therapy was covered without a second thought. He grew an inch, and then another. He learned the sign for falcon and taught it to everyone, and he called the tall, quiet man who'd knelt in the gravel by a name he'd invented himself, a made-up sign of his own, a flat hand moved from the ear to the heart. That meant, as near as Marin could translate it, the one who listens without ears. Cass wore that name like the only crown he'd ever wanted. Marin did not go back to waiting tables. She never touched another tray. She took the thing she'd always been good at, the relentless, exacting reading of money and its shadows, and she put it to work inside Cass's world, and within a year, the men who'd once objected to a waitress touching the books came to her with their columns and waited, hats in hand, for her to find the lie in them. She was not muscle. She never carried a gun. She was something the organization had never had, and could not now function without: a pair of eyes that saw the true shape of every number, and a conscience that slowly, quietly began to bend the whole ugly machine a few degrees toward something cleaner. Kaz let her. Kaz, it turned out, had been waiting his whole life for a reason to. It did not happen all at once, the softening between them. Marin had spent 3 years with her walls set in concrete, and Cass had spent 30 behind walls of his own. And 2 such people do not simply fall into each other because the plot has quieted. It came in small things. The coffee he learned to make exactly as she took it. The way she started leaving her hands where he could always see them across a room. So he was never once, in his own home, cut off from the conversation the way the world had cut him off his whole life. The night she woke from a dream of a wet road and found him already awake beside her, having felt the change in her breathing, signing nothing, just there. They built it the way careful people build anything that has to last, one honest brick at a time. No part of it borrowed, no part of it a lie, and Emil was always from the very first, the center of it. Kaz never tried to be the boy's father. He was something the boy had needed more and never had. An adult in his own world, powerful and unafraid, who moved through it in Emil's own silent language, and treated that language not as a limitation to be pitied, but as a strength to be proud of. Emil, who had spent his short life being spoken about over his head, found himself for the first time simply spoken to, by a man the whole house feared, and he grew straight and bright in the light of it, like something that had finally been planted in real soil. They did not marry in a hurry, and when they finally did, it was small. Emil, Lazar, a handful of the quiet men, a judge who owed Cass a favor and cried anyway. There was no crowd. There were no 300 guests. There was a man who had been alone for 30 years and a woman who had been invisible for 3, standing in front of each other, speaking vows in a language the whole small room could see, hands moving in the silence they both called home. Bexley, last anyone heard, was washing dishes in a diner 2 states away, and told no one where she'd worked before. Tobin never got his following back. The boy who'd chased a million strangers' eyes ended up somewhere very quiet, flinching at black cars for the rest of his life. Coralie simply vanished into an ordinary smallness, which was, in the end, the exact fate she'd tried so hard to hand to someone else. None of them ever understood what they'd actually done that night. They thought they'd set up a poor waitress with a broken man to laugh at her. What they'd actually done was introduce the only 2 people in the city who spoke the same silent language and hand a lonely king the one person who could finally hear him. On the last good night of that first strange year, Marin stood at the window of the old mill with Kaz behind her, his chin resting on the top of her head, both of them watching Emil chase the last of the light across the field below. She lifted her hands where he could see them over her shoulder, and she signed the thing she'd once signed to a stranger in a candlelit room, the small sentence that had started all of it. "Enjoy your meal," she signed, teasing. She felt his chest move with the silent laugh she'd learned to feel instead of hear. "I intend to," he signed against her hands, "for the rest of my life." And that is what happens when the world mistakes silence for weakness, when the people, who think they hold all the power, look straight past the quiet ones in the corner, and never once notice that the quiet ones have been listening the whole time. If this story got you the way it got me, if you cheered when Marin finally stopped shrinking, when Emil signed the one who listens without ears, when Drago realized far too late who he'd really been dealing with, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories where the overlooked and the underestimated turn out to hold every card, and tell me down in the comments, what was the exact moment you knew Marin was going to be just fine? I read every one. I'll see you in the next story.